The gun was already out when Junie hit the boards, and the man who would step between her and her husband was already moving, unaware that Garrett Shaw had just made the worst mistake of his life. Nobody in Laredo Flats moved. Nobody ever moved when Garrett Shaw was doing what Garrett Shaw did. But the quiet drifter on his way to the livery had heard the sound, the crack of a palm against a body, the kind you can't unhear once you know what makes it, and he walked right into the middle of it. Nobody in that town knew his name yet. Nobody knew he was the most hunted gunslinger west of the Pecos. This is the story of Junie Tate, partner. Spring of 1883, Laredo Flats, Texas. 20 years old, 2 years into a marriage that had swallowed her whole, and the stranger who stepped between her and the man who thought he owned the world. If this kind of story gets under your skin the way it gets under mine, go ahead and subscribe before we get rolling. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this fire reaches. Folks are listening from places I never expected, and every comment puts more wood on this particular flame. Now let's go back to where it really started. Spring came slow to Laredo Flats that year. The mesquite bloomed in pale yellow clusters, and the creek ran brown with runoff, and by the time April turned the corner into May, the whole town smelled of horse sweat and dried mud and the particular staleness of a place that had given up hoping for rain. It was a town of 300 souls, give or take, pressed against a dry river bend that the railroad had passed 20 miles to the south. The railroad men had looked at the lay of the land and kept going, and the town had never quite recovered from the snub. There were 2 churches in Laredo Flats, a hardware store, a livery, a general merchant, 2 saloons, and a telegraph office that worked maybe 4 days in 7. There was a sheriff named Dob Prentice who was 61 years old and had not drawn his sidearm in a decade. He drank his coffee at the same table in the same saloon every morning, read the same week-old newspaper, and made a show of walking the main street at noon. He was not a wicked man exactly. He was something worse, a tired one. And there was Garrett Shaw. Garrett Shaw owned the feed mill and the largest parcel of grazing land within 12 miles. He had 3 brothers, Cal, Doyle, and Hitch, who lived in the same rough county and rode into town together whenever Garrett needed an audience or a reason to be louder than anyone else in the room. He was 34 years old. 200 pounds of hard sunburned muscle under a black hat he never took off indoors. He was the kind of man who shook your hand a half-second too long, who held eye contact past the point of comfort, who used a man's first name before he'd been invited to. He'd married Junie Tate 2 years prior, and the town had watched it happen and kept its mouth shut. Nobody raised their voice about Garrett Shaw. That was understood in Laredo Flats the way the weather was understood, as something that simply was and that you adjusted to. Junie Tate had been 18 when she married him. Her father was dead. Her mother had gone back east to care for a sick sister and had not come back. Junie had been working tables at the Canton Grill when Garrett started sitting at her section every afternoon for 3 weeks in a row. He'd brought her a hat pin in a little paper box. He'd been, and she would think about this later with a kind of sick bewilderment, courteous. He'd spoken to her father's old friend, a man named Buckley, about the formal courtesy of Junie's hand, and Buckley had agreed before Junie had been told she was being considered. That was how things moved in Laredo Flats. That was the shape of the river, and everybody swam with it. The first time Garrett hit her, they had been married 6 weeks. She had burned the biscuits. Not badly, they were dark on the bottom, still soft in the center, but he swept the pan off the table without a word, and then turned and hit her with the flat of his hand so hard she walked into the wall. Then he sat back down, poured himself more coffee, and waited for supper. She told herself it was the once. A particular cruelty of men like that is how the first blow lands. Before you understand it is the beginning of a pattern, and by the time you see the pattern, the walls have already closed. By the end of that first year, Junie had learned the shape of Garrett's moods the way a sailor learns weather. There were days when he was slow-burning and watchful, and she moved through those days soft as smoke, touching nothing, speaking only when spoken to. There were days when the mill had gone wrong, or the hands had given him trouble, and on those days she tried to be invisible. And there were days, the worst ones, when he came home almost warm, and she made the mistake of relaxing, and that was always when it came. As if he'd been saving it behind a door she'd stupidly thought was locked. She learned to read the hour in the sound of his boots on the porch, the weight of each step, how long he paused at the door before he opened it. She learned to have his coffee ready and his supper on time without being asked, because being asked about something she'd forgotten carried its own cost. She learned that arguing back, even once, even on something small, seeded a longer and worse version of the same conversation later in the evening. She learned that weeping made it worse, and stillness sometimes helped, and there was no reliable map to the landscape of his moods. She was 20 years old, and she had become a student of one man's fury, the way other women her age were learning piano, or how to keep bees, or how to speak a second language. She thought about leaving. She thought about it the way you think about something that costs more than you have. The math was simple and terrible. No money, no allies in town, no place to run that wasn't already on land Garrett could reach. Her mother was 3 days east by rail. She had no rail money. She could walk. She had thought about walking, had actually stood in the dark kitchen at 2 in the morning and counted the miles in her head. But Garrett knew this country the way he knew the mill, every road and cut-off an empty stretch, and she was not at all certain he wouldn't find her before sunup. She had seen his face the one time she had come close to raising the subject of leaving. Not in those words, just a question about what a woman might do if a marriage wasn't what she had expected. He had looked at her across the table with an expression so flat and final that she had walked the question back before it fully formed. She went to Sheriff Prentice once, the previous October. She showed him her wrist, which had been bent wrong for 3 days and still ached in the cold. Prentice looked at it, then at her, then out his office window at the mill sign across the street. Shaw Feed and Grain, EST 1879, and delivered his verdict. Marriage was a covenant between a man and his wife and God, and the law didn't put its hands in the middle of that covenant. He wasn't cruel about it. He was worse than cruel. He was matter-of-fact. She walked home. Garrett was at dinner with his brothers that night. She sat alone and ate cold beans and stared at the oil lamp and thought about the distance to her mother's town back east, the price of a train ticket, and whether Garrett would catch her before she reached the station. She had no money. He made sure of that. There was one woman in town Junie trusted, Edna Purvis, who ran the telegraph office and had a habit of seeing clearly and keeping her own counsel about what she saw. Edna had been a widow for 11 years, had run her business alone for all of them, and had the particular quality of self-possession that sometimes comes to women who have outlasted everything the world aimed at them. She gave Junie small kindnesses without drawing attention to them. A box of crackers left on the counter with no price, a cup of tea when Junie came to send a wire to her mother, a brief grip of the hand once in the back room that contained more than Junie could have put into words. They never discussed Garrett directly. There was no need. Edna had eyes. By spring of 1883, Junie moved through the world like a woman who had learned that safety was borrowed and silence was survival. She was quiet. She was careful. She was 20 years old, and she looked sometimes like a woman twice that age. Roan came into Laredo Flats on a Thursday morning, the same way he'd come into a dozen towns before it. Dust on his coat, horse-tired. No particular reason to be there and no particular place else to go. He had a bedroll behind his saddle and a canvas bag with enough money in it to last 6 weeks if he ate plain and drank less than he wanted to. He had a Colt single-action Army on his right hip that he hadn't drawn in social company in 14 months. He was 41 years old, gray at the temples. A scar along his left jaw that could have been a knife or a thumbnail, depending on the light. His eyes were the color of winter water, pale and still, carrying the flat quality that men who've lived in violence sometimes hold without meaning to, the way a forge worker carries soot in the creases of his hands long after the fire is out. He left his horse at the livery, paid 2 days in advance, and found a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Pauley, who charged 40 cents a night and asked nothing beyond whether he needed extra blankets. He didn't. He ate a meal at the Canton Grill that was better than he'd expected, pork, cornbread, an honest coffee, and then he sat on the front step of the boarding house in the late afternoon and watched the street. He watched it the way he always watched streets in new towns, not searching for danger exactly. The way you read a river before you ford it, the current, the eddies, where the shallow places are. Every town had a shape. The shape of Laredo Flats, as best he could read it from an afternoon's watching, was the shape of a place that had made some accommodation with fear and had been living inside it so long it had stopped noticing the weight. He noticed it in the way people moved around the Shaw brothers when the brothers rode in that afternoon. The sidewalk thinned. Conversations dropped a register. A man who'd been arguing in the hardware store doorway stepped back inside. Not panic, something smoother than that. The practiced, unconscious giving of ground that people do when they've learned where the teeth are. The brothers rode past without incident. Roan watched them go. He clocked the eldest, the one in the black hat, and the way that man scanned the street. Not the scan of a visitor, the survey of a landlord. He went to bed at 9 and slept 6 hours, which was more than he usually managed. He was 3 days into Laredo Flats before he saw Junie. She came out of the general merchant on a Wednesday morning, a sack of flour balanced against her hip, and a list in her other hand. Small, smaller than everything else in that town seemed to be. Dark hair pinned under a calico bonnet, a dress the color of dry grass. She moved the way people move who have learned to take up as little space as possible, shoulders pulled in, gaze mostly down. But she looked up for a moment as she came down the step, and Roan, leaning against the post outside the barber shop with a cup of coffee going cold, caught the expression on her face. Not sadness exactly. Something more exhausted than sadness. The look of a person who has been sad so long that the feeling has calcified into something structural. The way a wound you never let heal becomes a scar you just carry. He watched her cross the street, watched the careful angle she took around a group of men outside the saloon, and then she was around the corner and gone. He did not think about her again until the following Friday. The following Friday was when Garrett Shaw came looking for her in the middle of Main Street. Roan was near the livery at the far end of the thoroughfare when he heard the commotion and turned. A knot of people had already pulled back from the center of the street, leaving a gap, and in that gap stood Garrett Shaw, And, on her knees in the dust, Junie. He had hit her at least once before Roan turned. The evidence was in the angle of her fall, the way she braced herself with both palms flat against the dirt, like a woman who'd learned not to be surprised by impact. Blood at the corner of her mouth. Not much. Enough. Shaw was talking at her. Roan couldn't make out the words at that distance, but he could read the register, the particular flat, measured fury that certain men use when they want the scene to look like control. His boot caught her ribs. Not hard enough to break anything, or maybe hard enough Roan couldn't know, but hard enough that she didn't rise. The street watched. That's the part that stays with you, partner, long after everything else fades. 20, maybe 25 people in view of that moment, and not one of them moved toward her. Some looked away. Some watched with a terrible, careful blankness. An old man on the hardware store porch set down his broom and went inside. Roan was moving before he finished the thought. He put himself between Junie and Garrett Shaw and stopped. He did not draw. He didn't touch anything. He stood in the 12 inches of air between Garrett Shaw's boot and Junie's body and looked at the man the way you look at a problem you're calculating how to solve. That's enough. 2 words. Level as a carpenter's line. Garrett Shaw looked at him. Later people would describe it different ways. Some would claim the stranger was expressionless, like a man doing a dull job. Some would say he looked almost bored, but a woman watching from the window of the dress shop 2 doors up would tell her daughter, years later, that the man who stepped between Junie and Garrett Shaw looked at Garrett like he already knew exactly how this story ended, all of it, and had simply come to wait for the rest of the world to catch up. Step aside. Garrett's voice dropped half a register, which with him was more dangerous than loud. You don't know who you're in the business of. I know enough. Garrett was not unaccustomed to fear. He had built a life on the existence of it in other people. But something in the stillness of the man in front of him, not the nervousness of a man playing brave, something older and more settled, registered in Garrett's animal brain before his pride could manage it. He looked at his brothers. Cal and Doyle had pulled up short behind him. Hitch waited at the far end of the street on his horse, uncertain whether to ride in. You ride through my town, Garrett continued, quieter now, and put your nose in my business. You have any idea what happens to men who do that? The stranger looked at him. Show me. Silence filled the street. Then Garrett Shaw smiled, the patience of a man certain of the outcome, and took a step back. Get her out of my sight. He walked. His brothers fell in behind him. The street let out a collective breath it hadn't known it was holding. Roan crouched down. Junie was already pushing herself to her knees, moving with the economy of someone who had gotten up off floors more times than she could count. She didn't look at him. She got her feet under her and reached for the flour sack she'd dropped, which had split and was bleeding white into the dirt. Leave it. His voice was near but not crowding her. She flinched, then looked at him, measuring, assessing, and whatever she found there seemed different enough from what she'd expected that some of the animal wariness in her face receded. I'm fine. An automatic answer, worn smooth with use. He straightened up, giving her the full width of the space. You need anything, I'm at Paulie's boarding house, room 4. She didn't answer. She left the flour in the street and walked away. He watched her go, then became aware that approximately 30 people were looking at him. He turned around and went back to what he'd been doing. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Someone knocked on the door of room 4 at Mrs. Pauley's boarding house. Roan had been awake for an hour. He answered the door already dressed, cup in hand. Junie stood in the gray pre-dawn hall, a shawl around her shoulders, with the composed, set face of a person who has made a decision they are not taking back. "Your name?" "Roan." "Just Roan?" "Mostly." She studied him. "What you did yesterday, what were you thinking?" "I wasn't, mostly." She glanced down the hall to confirm it was empty, then back. "He'll come for you." "I expect." "He has 3 brothers and half the county in his pocket. The sheriff won't stop him. Nobody will." "I know." She looked at him the way you look at a problem handed to you that you're not sure where to put. "Why are you still here? You could have been gone." Roan considered that. "I could, I'm not." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet, and maybe not ever, given what trust had cost her, but a willingness to continue the conversation. "He'll come for me next," she went on. "He always does." "Then you shouldn't be standing in a hallway." Roan stepped back from the doorway. "Come in. Let's talk about what comes next." She sat in the single chair in his room while he sat on the edge of the bed, and she talked for nearly an hour. She told it plain, without embellishment, the way people tell things when they've given up hoping the details will shock anyone. The 6 weeks before the first blow, the 2 years since. The morning she went to Prentice, what he'd delivered about God and covenants. The money she didn't have, the train ticket she couldn't buy, every road out of town that ran through Shaw's land. Roan listened. He didn't perform sympathy or insert comfort. He just listened with the kind of bare attention that is, in its own way, harder to sit with than pity, because it doesn't ask you to be smaller or easier or grateful. When she finished, she looked at her hands. Work rough, red at the knuckles, a bruise going yellow-green at the left wrist. "What do you need?" Roan's voice was direct. "What can you do?" A skeptical edge earned. "You know the Doogan Ranch, about 4 miles north? Empty since January. Old Doogan died. Still standing. A man could hold that position. Against 4 brothers and whatever hands Garrett calls up. If he was set up right." She looked at him directly, that measuring look, and put the question she'd been holding since yesterday. "Who are you?" He looked at his coffee cup, set it on the windowsill. "Just a man who's tired of watching people get hit." It wasn't the answer she was looking for. She left it there for the time being. It was Cal Shaw who made the connection. Cal was the second oldest, the one who read more than the others, and was proud of it in the way of men who've learned just enough to be dangerous. He'd been asking around about the stranger since Friday, and by Monday he had enough fragments to construct a picture that worried him considerably more than he let on to Garrett. He found his brother at the mill Tuesday morning and waited until the hands were out of earshot. That drifter rode a gray roan mare, single-action army, 7.5-inch barrel, scar on his left jaw. Cal put a handwritten paper on the open ledger between them, a physical description circulated by wire 2 years prior from the U.S. Marshal's office in El Paso. They called him the Laramie Ghost, on account of 2 men tried to collect his bounty at Laramie in '79. Both survived. Both retired from the gun trade the following morning. Garrett read the paper, read it again. His face didn't change much. He was good at that. But something behind his eyes recalibrated. $300, federal. Cal folded the paper. He killed a deputy marshal's nephew in Abilene in 1880. Self-defense, but the marshal's family had reach. Garrett set the ledger aside. He was quiet a while. "3 brothers," he said finally, "and 12 hands who know which side their wages come from, and a sheriff who does what he's told." He looked at Cal steadily. "1 man." Cal gave a slow nod, but he was not, in that moment, entirely certain. Junie found out who Roan was that same afternoon, from a different source entirely. Edna Purvis ran the telegraph office and made it her personal mission to know everything that moved through Laredo Flats before it moved elsewhere. She'd heard about Cal's inquiry, wired El Paso to confirm the details herself, and pulled Junie into the back room of the general merchant between a barrel of dried beans and a stack of feed sacks to deliver the information in a rapid whisper. The Laramie Ghost, wanted in 3 territories, 11 confirmed kills in his file, the true number believed to be higher. Had ridden as hired protection for cattle outfits in the north, then gone quiet around 1881. No one knew where he'd been since. Junie walked home, carrying that knowledge in her chest, and thought about the man who'd handed her his room number and the courtesy of her own space in the same quiet sentence. The man who'd listened to an hour of her life without flinching, who'd asked what she needed. She thought about the 12 inches of air he'd put between her and Garrett's boot, the flat, unimpressed way he'd looked at a man who'd spent a decade collecting other people's fear. She thought about "I'm not" when she'd asked him why he was still in town. She knocked on his door again that evening. He opened it and waited. "The Laramie Ghost," she said. He held her gaze a moment, then stepped aside. "That's what they call me," he said. "I don't tend to lead with it." She sat in the chair. "Is it true? Abilene?" "Marshall's nephew, not a deputy." He settled on the edge of the bed. He came into a saloon with 4 friends to collect. 2 men who had nothing to do with him died in the crossfire. I didn't start it. I was the only one who finished it. Why the bounty? If it was self-defense? The marshal's brother had a senator's ear. Some men's deaths cost less than other men's grief. He was matter-of-fact about it, the way you are about the weather after long enough. "I've stayed west of El Paso mostly. This is the farthest east I've been in 2 years. Why here?" Horse was tired. A pause. I was tired. A beat of quiet. Then she went to the thing she'd actually come to discuss. The Doogan Ranch. What were you thinking with it? And so he laid it out. The Doogan Ranch was a 4-room adobe on a slight rise above a dry creek bed, with clear sight lines to the road from the northeast and west. Old man Doogan had run cattle there for 30 years. His son was back east and had no interest in Texas soil. The buildings were solid. The well still worked. The approach from the south, the likely direction any Shaw party would ride from, ran through a narrow cut between 2 limestone shelves. Roan had walked the property twice. He had a way of reading land slowly and completely, checking for soft boards the way a carpenter checks a floor. He'd noted the cut, the dry wash that ran parallel to the south road, and could conceal a man without being visible from the road, the angle of the midday sun and the late afternoon sun, and which way the dust would blow in an east wind. "If they ride in from town, they'll funnel through the cut," he explained. "There's no other approach that doesn't add 3 miles and telegraph their intention. I can string a tripwire across the far end, ankle height to a horse, not meant to harm anyone, just to tangle the lid animals and slow the column. Buy time." "Time for what?" "Time to get them talking instead of shooting. Most men, given the choice between uncertainty and conversation, will talk." He looked at the table between them. "I'd rather nobody dies." "You've been in gunfights." "That doesn't mean I find them comfortable." He looked out toward the window. Garrett Shaw is the kind of man who needs an audience for his violence. Put him in a situation where the audience is gone and the outcome isn't certain, and some of what he is goes out of him. You don't know Garrett. I know the type. No arrogance in it, the tone of a doctor who has seen a condition many times. He's not a coward, but he's grown used to holding all the cards. A man like that, when the deck shifts wrong, spends half his attention on how the situation looks. And what do you need from me? I need you to know how to fire a pistol, he said, and to be willing to use one. She held his gaze. My father taught me before he died. I've been thinking about doing it for 2 years. He gave a slow nod, the kind that means information received. Good. That'll save us time. They moved to the Doogan Ranch before dawn the next morning, Junie with a bag of essentials and Roan with everything he owned, which was not much. She'd breathed no word to anyone in town except Edna Purvis, who received a sealed envelope to be opened if neither of them was seen by Saturday. The days at the ranch had a quality that Junie would struggle to describe later when people got around to asking. Not peaceful exactly. They both understood what was coming. But the adobe stillness and those long sight lines had something in them she hadn't felt in 2 years. Maybe longer. The quality of being in a space where no one was about to suddenly become a different, worse version of themselves. Roan showed her the limestone shelf above the cut where he'd take his position. He showed her where the tripwire would go, 15 feet of thin rope between 2 cedar posts. He walked her through the escape route if everything went wrong. Out the back window, due north. 1.5 miles to the Crane family ranch, who owed Doogan goodwill from a hard winter and were not Shaw people. Then he gave her the spare pistol from his saddlebag, an older cap-and-ball Navy conversion, but one that shot clean. He watched her check the cylinder the way a person checks something they know, and something in his face eased. They spent the first full afternoon at the ranch practicing on fence posts. Not the way you might expect. Not standing in a row firing repeatedly to build confidence. He had her dry fire it dozens of times with no powder and no ball. Just the pull of the hammer and the clean fall of the mechanism. He talked her through her stance, feet wider than felt natural, the offhand steadying, the breath out before the trigger knot after. He was methodical about it, patient in the way of a man who has no schedule and nowhere else to be. When they moved to live fire, she shot a tin cup off a post from 40 feet on the 4th attempt. He said nothing except the slight change in his posture, a very small settling, like a man watching a new door open. She asked him that evening how many men he had been in gunfights with. He thought about it honestly. More than most, fewer than the file claims. Were you afraid? He considered that too. Every time. Fear tells you something is real. A man who walks into a gunfight without fear is usually the first one to make a fatal mistake, because he's not paying attention to what the fear is trying to report. She'd never thought about it that way. She turned that over while the fire burned low. What does fear tell you? She said finally. That the outcome isn't decided yet. He looked at the coals. Which is the same thing as saying it can still go right. They talked less the next day and worked more, stringing the tripwire, walking the positions, rehearsing the angles until the geography felt like something she could navigate in the dark. By the second day, she was moving between the rear window and the back door and the bunkhouse roof without prompting, assessing sight lines as naturally as she might check the weather. There was something in that readiness that felt, she realized, like the first solid thing she had stood on in 2 years. When it's time, he said on that final evening, don't hesitate. Will I know when? You'll know. She turned the pistol over in her hands. You're going to tell him to leave. First. And if he doesn't, I'll give him a reason to think it through. He looked at the limestone shelf, then back. If it becomes a genuine fight, and it might, I need you at that rear window with a clear line on the yard. Not in the cut where they can see you. You're the last line, Junie, not the first. She nodded. She was not trembling. She was, if anything, more still than he'd seen her since the flour sack on the ground. Roan. He looked at her. Why? It wasn't the tactical why, it was the real one, the one underneath everything. He was quiet a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I watched my mother take what you've been taking. For 8 years. I was too young and too small to do anything about it for most of it. The man she'd married was not as dangerous as Garrett Shaw. He was dangerous enough. He looked at the wall for a moment. I left home at 16, she stayed. The silence had weight. She didn't die of fever, Junie said, not a question. No, she didn't. She didn't perform sorrow for him. She understood he wasn't offering it for condolence. He was telling her so she understood where he was standing when he recognized the shape of her situation on first glance. That doesn't explain what you became, she said. No, it doesn't. A pause. Some of what I am now is what happens to a man who learned to solve problems with a gun because he didn't know how else to solve them. I'm trying to find out if there's a version of this that doesn't add more to that ledger. She looked at him for a long moment. There might be. She meant more than a tactical observation, and they both understood that, and neither of them said anything else about it. Garrett Shaw came on a Friday evening, dusk, with his 3 brothers and 7 hired hands. Roan had expected 10. He'd prepared for 12. 11 was workable. He'd been on the limestone shelf since mid-afternoon, flat and still in the cooling light, watching the road. They came in a loose column, not military, too casual for that, too certain of the outcome. Garrett at the front on his black horse, the brothers trailing, the hands spread wide behind them. They weren't trying for quiet. That was its own kind of message. The column hit the cut at the bottom of the rise. The tripwire caught the front 3 horses at once. Not violently. Thin rope at ankle height against walking horses doesn't throw anyone, but the sudden check sent a ripple of confusion backward through the column. 2 horses shied hard. One hand went sideways in his saddle, caught himself, swore loud enough to carry up the hill. For 30 seconds the column was nothing but cursing men and spooked animals, nobody quite clear on what had happened. Roan stood up on the shelf. He didn't draw. He stood there in the last light, visible. Garrett Shaw. His voice carried the way voices carry in open country, clean, unhurried. You've ridden a long way on a hot evening for no good reason. Best to turn around now. Garrett had his horse under control. He looked up at the shelf, at the man standing there, without urgency or theater, present the way a rock is present. For just a moment something moved across Garrett's face that was not quite fear, but existed in its neighborhood. He covered it fast. You've got a rope around your neck in 3 territories, Ghost. Garrett's voice climbed the hill without strain. I've got the paper to prove it. Come down and I'll make this quick. You rode 11 men out here for 1 retired gun, Roan observed. What does that tell you about how confident you are in the outcome? A ripple moved through the hands. Men looked sideways at each other. 11 is not an embarrassing number until someone points out it's 11 to 1 and the one man is standing on a hill with no visible concern. Cal had gone very still. He'd read enough of the file. Garrett pressed forward. "That woman is my wife." "She was your wife. She's not going back." Something cracked in Garrett's expression. Something underneath the calculated fury. Something older and rawer. The part of a man like that which has always known on some level that the world his behavior depended on, other people's inability to stop him, was more fragile than he'd told himself. He drew. It was fast. The Colt came up and he fired before most of the men around him had registered the motion. The shot went wide left, not because Garrett was a poor shot, he wasn't, but because Roan had already moved. A sidestep so deliberate and small it looked like an afterthought, the adjustment of a man who has been reading these moments long enough to see them half a second early. Rock dust from the shelf behind him. Roan did not draw. Last chance. Same voice, same register. Words a man says when he means them and has nothing left to add. Then, from the rear window of the Doogan Ranch house, from the position that looked out across the yard, came a second shot. Clean and level. It found Garrett Shaw's gun hand at the wrist. Not the kill shot, partner, the pivot shot, the one that changed the arithmetic. It came from Junie, who had spent 2 years being invisible in a house with a violent man, who had not in all that time forgotten what her father taught her about lining up the sights, and who had, in that moment, at that window, decided she was done being the thing that got aimed at. Garrett's gun hit the dirt. He grabbed his wrist and his horse shifted under him. He nearly went down. Then silence. The hands looked at one another. They looked at the hill where Roan still stood, still not drawing. They looked at the window of the ranch house, at the smoke hanging where it had come from. These men were not Shaw loyalists in any deep sense. They were Shaw employees, and the wage arrangement had just shifted in a fundamental way. Cal pulled his horse around first, without a word. 3 hands followed before Garrett could speak, 2 more after them. Doyle and Hitch looked at their brother. Doyle reached over, took Garrett's reins, and began leading the horse back through the cut. Garrett led him. He was pale under the sunburn, jaw set, eyes fixed on the hillside. But Roan was already gone from the shelf, had moved before the dust settled, already coming down the back of the limestone. When the last rider disappeared around the cut, Roan walked into the ranch house. Junie was at the window, pistol still in her hand, not lowered until the final hoofbeat faded. She turned when she heard his boots. "You said last line." "You were." "Did I do it right?" He looked at her at the window, at the yard. "You did, exactly right." She looked at the pistol. Then she set it on the windowsill and sat down against the wall, and the shaking came, the kind that arrives after the fear has passed and the body catches up on what it went through. He sat down on the floor a few feet away, not touching, and they stayed there in the going dark without speaking for a while. The story might have ended there, one wounded man and a diminished column retreating to town in the dusk, but it didn't because Garrett Shaw had never accepted an ending that wasn't his. He got his wrist wrapped by the barber, the nearest thing Laredo Flats had to a surgeon. He sat in the back room of the Copper Rails Saloon and drank whiskey with his good hand and didn't speak for 2 hours. His brothers sat around him. Cal looked at the table. Doyle looked at the wall. Hitch drank. Finally, Garrett looked up. "Tomorrow night, all of it, we burn it out." "Garrett," Cal began. "I heard you every time you started that sentence," Garrett cut him off. "I'm done hearing it. Cal sat there and looked at the table and thought about what he actually knew about the Laramie file. The ghost had been called a ghost not because he was hard to find, but because of what he left behind. Not bodies, mostly situations. Men who woke to find that every advantage they'd held had been quietly, efficiently dismantled while they were busy being certain of themselves. The deputies' men in Abilene had woken to find their ammunition redistributed, their horses moved to the next town, and a signed deposition, names, dates, prior threats, in the hands of a judge in Kansas who happened to be on poor terms with the Marshall's family. Cal thought about the note with Edna Purvis, sealed, opens Saturday. Garrett, his voice was flat. Edna Purvis has a document from the Shaw woman, sealed, open Saturday if neither of them is seen. Garrett's eyes moved to him. That's a deposition, Cal went on. 2 years of it, probably. Detailed. He kept his voice even. You put a torch to that ranch house, the note opens. It goes to whoever the ghost has already been talking to, and we've seen what he can arrange when he's arranging things, not just shooting things. Garrett's face was doing something complicated. Think about who's in your ledgers, Cal pressed. The county contracts, the mill commission, the grazing rights you negotiated with Prentice 2 years back. Think about what the wrong judge does with a woman's 2-year accounting and a federal wanted man who has every reason to make that accounting stick. The silence in the back room stretched long. Sheriff Dobb Prentice came to the Doogan Ranch Saturday morning. He came alone, which was itself a kind of statement. He knocked on the door instead of announcing from the yard, which was another one. Roan opened it. Prentice looked at him, then passed him at Junie, who stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, the Navy pistol on the table at her elbow. Prentice had the look of a man who had arrived at a version of himself he did not entirely recognize, and was deciding whether that was salvageable. Garrett Shaw has agreed to a dissolution, Prentice delivered. Legal terms, property assessment. She gets the cabin and the East Road parcel. He keeps the mill. He paused. Through his lawyer, he's also agreed to a mutual restraint on filing. A glance at Roan. On condition certain federal documentation travels no further than it already has. Roan said nothing. I have the paperwork. Prentice held up a folded document. Her signature makes it legal inside the week. Junie looked at Roan. He was watching Prentice with the flat, patient look. He gave the smallest nod, not approval exactly. Information. This is real. She took the document. She read it. She had read enough of Garrett's business papers over 2 years to understand what legal language looked like and what it was hiding, and this one, as best she could tell, was hiding nothing she hadn't been promised. She signed it. Prentice took it back and put it inside his coat. He looked at her, and something moved across his face, guilt adjacent, the expression of a man who has done a small, decent thing 2 years too late and knows it. Mrs. Shaw, it's Tate, she said. Junie Tate. He nodded. He looked at Roan one last time, deciding visibly whether to raise the matter of wanted men and federal jurisdiction, and deciding this particular Saturday morning was not that morning, and then walked back to his horse and rode to town. The town changed after that. Slowly, the way towns change when a thing that has been unsaid for a long time finally gets said. Not overnight. But the weight shifted. 2 of Garrett Shaw's hands quit by Tuesday. A third went to see Edna Purvis about a labor dispute with a mill owner, which suggested that the understanding of what Shaw could and couldn't be protected against had filtered further than Garrett would have liked. Ferris, the hardware store owner, stopped retreating inside when the Shaw brothers rode by. He stood in his doorway instead. Small thing, not a small thing. The Canton Grill owner, a man named Braddock who had watched Junie work his tables for a year before Garrett married her, left a basket of provisions on the East Road cabin porch one morning with a note in it that read simply, "Good for you." His handwriting was large and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who did not write much. She kept that note in a box for years. Doyle and Hitch Shaw, who had ridden in as Garrett's seconds and ridden out looking at the ground, were seen less often in town after that. Cal remained, kept his head down, ran his own small farm with the careful efficiency of a man who has looked into a particular future and decided to invest in a different one. He was not a good man. He had known what his brother was and had been useful to him. But he was, in the end, a man who could read a situation when the situation became legible enough. Garrett did not leave Laredo Flats right away. He ran his mill. He sat at his table in the copper rail. He was not a broken man. A broken man has admitted that something has broken him. He was a man who had been shown the edge of a consequence he hadn't fully believed in, and that knowledge sat differently in him, made him smaller in the way that genuine limits always do, made him slightly less certain, slightly less inclined to test what other people would and wouldn't bear. Not perfect justice, partner. It rarely is out here. The balance doesn't always come all the way level. But a shift, and in a town that had been still as a held breath for a long time, a shift counted for something real. Roan stayed 2 weeks. He helped Junie put the East Road cabin in order. The roof leaked. The porch board was soft. The kitchen wanted a new stovepipe section. He was good with his hands the way men are who have had to be. She fed him well, which he ate without ceremony, and they talked in the evenings in the particular way of two people who have been through something together and have nothing left to prove to each other. On one of those evenings she asked him where he was going. He looked at the sky over the mesquite, deep purple with the last of the light. North. The federal paper, is it actually gone? I made arrangements. She understood this to mean it was not gone. It was simply in a location that made it inconvenient for everyone who might want to act on it. She filed that away. Will they come for you, further east? Probably not here, he said. Prentice has too many reasons to be disinterested. A pause. Further east is a different story. Then go west. He almost smiled, a rare thing on his face, but not an unpleasant one. I'll consider it. On the morning he left, she walked out to the yard with him while he saddled the gray. The morning was cool and the mesquite was bright in the early light, and from the East Road cabin Junie could see 3 miles of open country that was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely hers to look at, without anyone telling her what to see in it. Roan. He was cinching the saddle. He paused. Thank you. Not performed, just the 2 words, level, the way she said things she meant. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was as close to peace as she'd seen in him. Not happiness exactly, but the quality of a man who has carried something a long time and set it down, briefly, in a place that felt like a reasonable place to set it. Take care of yourself, Junie Tate. You too. He rode north. She watched until the road curved and the mesquite closed around the distance. Then she went inside and made herself coffee and sat at her own table in her own house and listened to the morning, which was quiet in the way that quiet can be when it belongs to you. She built the schoolhouse 3 years later. 1 room on the east end of her property, with 11 children the first year and 23 the second. She taught reading and arithmetic and, in the afternoons when the regular lessons were done, she taught the older girls how to read a contract before they signed one and what their names were worth. Nobody heard from Garrett Shaw after he sold the mill in 1886 and moved west toward Arizona. That's where men go when the shape of the place they've been living in stops fitting them. As for Roan, there are stories. A gray roan horse seen in a particular county. A man who stepped between a woman and a situation she hadn't chosen, and then went on. The federal warrant was formally withdrawn in 1887 when the marshal's brother died, and his son, a more reasonable man by all accounts, looked at the file and decided the resources required were not worth what they'd recover. Nobody knows where Roan ended up. I've heard 3 different towns claim him. The honest answer is that men like that don't end up anywhere you can pin on a map. They just keep going, carrying the ledger, setting it down when they can, picking it back up when they have to. I'm an old man now, partner, and I've had a long time to think about what happened in Laredo Flats in the spring of 1883. About a town that looked away for 2 years and then slowly stopped. About a woman who had been told in 100 different ways that her name wasn't worth much, who then signed it clean on a piece of paper that set her free and put it on a schoolhouse door. There's something I've come to believe, sitting by this fire over the years. The real darkness isn't the violent man. You can eventually see him. The real darkness is the silence that forms around him, the comfortable practiced looking away that tells him he can go on. The silence is what needs breaking, and it almost never gets broken by a speech or a petition or a church meeting. It gets broken by one person who refuses to look away. One person who walks across the street and puts themselves in 12 inches of air and says, "That's enough." 2 words, level as a carpenter's line. Sometimes that's all it takes to remind the rest of the street that they still have the ability to act, that they had it all along, and just needed someone to go first. Prentice retired the following spring, and the man who replaced him as sheriff was younger and more willing to put his hands in the middle of things. Nothing so dramatic as a transformation. Just a steady, incremental reduction in the space that a man like Garrett Shaw had previously been allowed to occupy without consequence. The water table of the town's fear dropped, slowly, the way water tables do when you stop feeding them. Most folks, they hear this story and they remember the ghost, the famous gun, the Laramie file. But what I keep coming back to, the part I can't shake, is the shot from the window. The woman who had been invisible for 2 years, who had watched and waited and learned, who fired once and hit exactly what she aimed at. That's the shot that broke it. Not the famous gun, not the traps or the tripwire or the arrangements the Laramie ghost made before any of us could see the whole board. The shot from Junie Tate, who had spent 2 years being told she couldn't do anything, and who had quietly, all that time, been learning what she could. There is a thing people say about the frontier, about the rawness of it, the lack of the structures and protections that eastern cities could offer. They say it as a criticism, usually. But there was another side to that coin, and Junie Tate found it in the spring of 1883. Out here, on the far edge of civilization, sometimes the only thing that decided what was possible for a person was what they were willing to do when they got to the edge. She got to her edge. She found out she was steady. Your past may explain you, partner, but it does not have to define you. The hardest thing in the world is to believe you are worth defending. Junie Tate took 2 years to believe it, and then proved it in a single shot on a Friday evening at dusk, with the mesquite turning gold in the last light. I don't know that you could ask for much more from a person than that. And sometimes the person who has been kept smallest the longest turns out to have the steadiest hand. Keep your powder dry and your soul honest, until our trails cross again. This story is a work of fiction, created for your entertainment, with the assistance of artificial intelligence in both the writing and the production. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed the ride, please hit like and subscribe, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see where this fire has reached tonight. Every single comment from every corner of the country adds something to this fire, and I read more of them than you might think. I'll see you on the next one, partner.